Boy mocked every day for walking deer until they saw its eyes. He stood by his kitchen window as he had throughout the week, keen on seeing if it would happen again. For the past 7 days, the most unimaginable thing had been occurring at precisely 7 in the morning. He set his coffee aside as the hour hand hit 7, and sure enough, it happened. Greg Banducci was your average middle-aged dad living in Minnesota. Greg woke up early every morning to fix his town breakfast as a diner owner in the local neighborhood. His life had always been a simple one with little to surprise him, and for the most part, Greg loved this sense of familiarity. That was until that fateful week that threatened to turn his life upside down. Greg had moved to Minnesota in his late 20s with his wife Cheryl, who was pregnant with their first child. What attracted him to Minnesota was the seemingly endless physical features that the state boasted. For Greg, there was no better place to raise a family. After settling in, he bought an old restaurant and renovated it, turning it into a beloved diner that soon became the source of his livelihood. As far as he was concerned, life was perfect. Greg spent a decade raising his family in Minnesota. He'd seen all that his town had to offer throughout this time. He'd witnessed wildlife roam the streets at night and early morning. He'd lived through several instances where dangerous animals strayed into the town, prompting wildlife services to intervene. None of what he'd seen would live up to what occurred that week. The week that it happened had been as typical as any for Greg. As was his routine, he woke up at 5 and ran through the day's logistics before making breakfast for his family. With everything done, he got dressed and stood by the kitchen window to take in the sunrise as he sipped his coffee. And that's when it happened. The first thing Greg heard was a scream. It was not from someone getting hurt or scared, but a shout of excitement. A giggle followed through, then some laughs. Mornings in Greg's neighborhood were always quiet. So why was this particular one different? Greg put his coffee aside and stepped out of the house. What he saw made him cock his head back. Before Greg stood a group of kids going to school. They were trailing behind a boy Greg recognized as Miles, his neighbor's 10-year-old son. Greg thought the kids were bullying Miles, which made him want to intervene. He was about to call the kids out when he caught what Miles was doing. Before Miles was a small deer peacefully walking as it grazed. The boy was walking behind it, interested in what the deer was doing. A smile took Greg's face. It wasn't abnormal for kids to watch or even play with deer, especially ones as young as the one before Miles. He returned to the house. If only he knew what was truly happening. The next day was no different. Greg heard the kids screaming and yelling, and when he hurried out, Miles was walking behind the tiny deer. The rest of the week followed the same route, and although Greg didn't want to acknowledge it, he knew something bigger was happening. By Friday, Greg knew he had to uncover what was happening between Miles and the deer. He'd planted a camera on his garage door the previous day to learn what the 10-year-old was doing. The camera footage didn't reveal anything that he didn't know already. Miles would walk around with the deer every morning at 7 before leading it back to the woods. So, what was happening? Greg woke up earlier than usual that Friday morning. He ran through the day's logistics and made breakfast by 6. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, he stood in the kitchen window waiting for Miles and his friend to come out. Minutes passed with nothing consequential happening. But as the clock neared 7, kids flocked out of their houses to wait for Miles, who had become some sort of rock star. A minute passed, and Miles didn't show up. But as the second minute came to a close, he emerged at the furthest point of the neighborhood, the deer beside him as they walked from lawn to lawn. It was then that Greg realized what the boy was doing. He rushed out of the house, hurrying to Miles before it was too late. Throughout the week, Greg had wondered what Miles was doing. He'd zoned out at work several times, trying to place the pieces to this wondrous mystery. As he cut through the damp grass, everything suddenly made sense. But although he'd unlocked the mystery, he was nowhere close to the absolute truth. He's feeding the deer, Greg thought as he finally neared the two. He slowed down so as not to spook the animal. But the closer he got, the more he realized what was truly happening. The deer's eyes were like none Greg had ever seen. They were milky gray and sightless, even as the deer walked beside Miles. It was at that moment everything finally clicked. Miles had been taking his time in the morning to help the deer find grass patches because it was blind. Greg's jaw slackened at the revelation, and he took a step back, still unsure of what he'd learned. A week later, An IDNR-licensed wildlife rehabilitation group picked up the deer. Of course, Greg and Miles' parents explained everything to him, lauding him for his sense of duty and responsibility. They were worried the town's decision hurt him, but he assured them he was glad the deer would get the help she needed.